Hello, and welcome to the 57th episode of NEOHUMAN Podcast. I'm Aga Bahari, a Dogologist on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow the show on liveinlimbo.com, iTunes, YouTube, and BitChute. And today with me, I have retired Brigadier General Dr. Robert Spalding. Welcome to NEOHUMAN Podcast, Dr. Spalding.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. How about we start from the beginning, the work you've done, the lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Yeah, so I just retired from the Air Force after almost 27 years being a B-2 pilot and spending a lot of time focused on China. I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute where I'm at today, but also working on educating and advocating for understanding the challenges of closed systems being integrated with the globalized, internet-connected world.
And perhaps the best example for the closed system that you focus on is the Chinese system.
Right. Clearly the Chinese Communist Party is the most predominant in that system, but there's others.
How would you describe the Chinese communist system? Because for a lot of people, it's unclear. Xi Jinping is called the president, but we don't remember an election. And then he was elevated to become a lifelong president. So, and I don't even think that they're calling him a president. Is he a chairman for life? Or how do you describe the system of their governance?
Yeah, well, I mean, it can be very confusing because they have a party and then they have a government. And in China, there's two constitutions. There's the PRC, People's Republic of China Constitution, and there's the Chinese Communist Party Constitution. So it's actually confusing for governments as well because you interface diplomatically with the government, but yet the sovereign, the one that makes the decisions for the country, is the party. And so if you think about our State Department, for example, it represents the sovereign for the country, and yet it interfaces with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which essentially is part of the People's Republic of China structure. But if you look at where the decisions are made, it's within the Chinese Communist Party. So diplomatically, we don't even interface with the sovereign. Now, Xi is most widely known as president of China, but his real power comes from being the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. This is the real authority within China.
He's known as a president even within China. It's pretty clear his position that is, I don't want to say a dictator, but that's how he's being referred to by a lot of people in the West. So how do Chinese people look at him as?
Well, I think it depends on, one of the affectionate terms that the Chinese Communist Party pushes is Xi Dada, which is, Papa Xi. But he is the general secretary of the party, and that's where the power really resides. And the same thing for provinces within China. You'll have a provincial governor, but the real power in the province will be the head of the Chinese Communist Party in that province. And really that is the way the system is run. The party controls everything.
This system actually sounds really familiar to me because I'm originally from Iran. And this is a mistake that a lot of Western governments, from the perspective of people like me, we're totally in favor of not reform, but overthrowing of the government, Islamic Republic government in Iran, the regime, because there is a supreme leader who is electing. I'm sure you know that a bunch of people who are unelected, but the people who are the Westerners are negotiating with are the people who are presenting the government, president and all of that.
Right.
And exactly because of that, and this is the thing with China, any kind of an agreement, like the nuclear agreement, we had no confidence that Iranians will abide to that agreement. So how does the system, duality of the system works with respect to, let's say, these recent talks with the Chinese, you can say Chinese government, because obviously they're not communicating with the Chinese party?
Right. Well, I mean, as you know, most agreements that we've had with the Chinese Communist Party or the PRC have not fulfilled their end of the bargain. And so when you look at the trade agreement, essentially what happened is that we essentially forego the 15 December proposed tariffs, and then also reduce some of the existing tariffs. And so if you look at, since we did that already, and you're looking at who's going to fulfill their side of the agreement, if you look at the fact that they don't actually fulfill their side of the agreement, what they were able to negotiate was in effect a delay of the December 15th tariffs and the reduction of the current tariffs. That's what they negotiated. And this is typical for the way that the United States negotiates with the Chinese Communist Party. We will automatically hold up our end of the bargain, and they just won't fulfill theirs. And so it's hard to get Americans to understand that when you negotiate, you actually have to wait to see if they're actually going to, respect that agreement before you implement. Have some kind of leverage in the negotiation at all times, because for the Chinese, an agreement is the beginning of negotiations anyway.
Yeah. I want to talk about your book, Stealth War, but since we were talking about trade agreement, I just want to read for our audience. There are 7 deadly sins that is presented by, I believe, Peter Navarro with respect to the Chinese agreement, that stop stealing our intellectual property, stop forcing technology transfers, stop hacking our computers, stop dumping into our markets and putting our companies out of business, stop state-owned enterprise from heavy subsidies, stop the importation of fentanyl, and stop the currency manipulation. How exactly is United States going to make the Chinese stop doing any of these things? I mean, forget about 7 of them.
Yeah, we're not going to. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is going to do what they want to do, and I think this is the problem with our system is because most of corporate America and Wall Street have essentially align themselves with the model that currently exists. The tariffs introduce disruption into their supply chains, into their businesses, and so they just want them to go away. They're not concerned about the erosion of the economic competitiveness of the United States or the social fabric of the country, or even given the fact that there's no equal playing field either here in the United States when it comes to China and U.S. companies, or in China. And so, not to mention, so those things, 7 things you mentioned, just remember Facebook, Amazon, Google, Twitter, these companies that are making money around the world are not even allowed to operate within China. So never mind the fact that Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, which are essentially the Chinese equivalents, are freely operating in the West. In fact, you can, in a taxi in New York now, you can pay with Alipay. So they're actually allowing electronic payments through these systems. So it's amazing the level of access that their companies are granted and our companies are not.
And I think this makes a lot of sense based on the title of your book. I actually noticed this today. This came to my mind that it's called Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. You're not saying how China is taking over, how China took over. So from your perspective, it's over. China has taken over already.
Yeah, and you can see that, for instance, in 2017 in June, the EU for the first time declined to essentially put in to support a sanction at the UN on China for human rights. In the same time, last month, there was a motion to condemn China for what they're doing with the concentration camps and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang or East Turkestan. And 54 countries sided with China. I think 32 sided with the United States. If you look at the UN Human Rights Council, Venezuela was recently added to be on the Human Rights Council. China is trying to change the definition of human rights so that providing economic benefit to the population is the paramount human right that a government should provide, and all other rights essentially go to the government leadership. There was recently a change in the head of agriculture at the UN, which does a lot of the food donations on behalf of the United Nations. He leads that effort. There was a U.S. candidate, there was a Georgian Secretary of Agriculture, not the state of Georgia, but the country of Georgia, and the Chinese had a candidate of their own. A Chinese candidate won that position. So in the World Bank, it was recently revealed that China has been lent by the World Bank $60 billion and recently put through a motion in secret to ensure that they get a billion to a billion and a half each year thereafter, really into perpetuity. And they've put Chinese in place in directorships within the bank to ensure that they control all of the things that are going on within the bank. They even had a loan from the World Bank that was they applied for, that was going to allow them to put cameras up in Xinjiang to monitor Uyghurs. So and they then, by the way, got $60 billion out of the Asian Development Bank. The WTO doesn't really have the ability to enforce. So across every international institution, these international institutions that were created, by the way, to promote democratic principles, human rights, civil liberties, rule of law, free trade, they're essentially now promoting Chinese Communist Party national interests, which are really to benefit the growing economy of China, to provide employment for the Chinese people so that they don't overthrow them because they're an oppressive totalitarian regime. I mean, it's quite a simple model, and we've played our part quite well.
So how did we get here? Now, I also want to ask that what is the point of having any kind of negotiation if this is what's happening, and basically China has, as you were saying, China has already taken over. And I was just looking at the amount of money that they're spending in South America side by side with the amount of money that in foreign aid United States is spending in South America. It's just something that is not even comparable. And everything that they're doing, I guess, on the back of their centralized system, that the decision is being made on a central core of their system, and then the solutions are being provided. Yet in America, we are arguing about whether or not Trump said we or me in the phone call with the Ukraine. How did we get here?
Well, so at the end of the Cold War, we basically said, our foreign policy became about integrating all of these authoritarian countries into the open system. And we believed by integrating them into the open system, by allowing them to have economic growth, that over time free trade or open markets would lead to wealth, and then wealth would lead to democracy in these countries. And essentially what happened, that happened for a time, but then the authoritarian regimes got wise, particularly led by China after Tiananmen massacre. They realized that they needed to have access to the technology, talent, innovation, and capital of the West, but they needed to protect themselves from democratic principles. And so they created things like the Great Firewall. They forced indoctrination at all grade levels in the universities and in the schools. So everywhere from kindergarten to university, you're taught about the primacy of the Communist Party. All textbooks have been rewritten. Libraries have been scrubbed of anything that resembles history that doesn't toe the Chinese Communist Party line. In fact, online journals in China have been scrubbed. There was one, the China Quarterly, which is a famous UK publication with regard to China. They had taken out certain articles in that publication voluntarily because the Chinese Communist Party told the Cambridge University that they needed to do that. So there's been this wholesale scrub of all knowledge and all history and all education and all media within China in order to suppress any knowledge of either the Chinese people's own history or the history of democracy or freedom. So in other words, what they try to do is make sure that you never have access to speak about democracy or learn about democracy, and then you don't know what democracy is. Essentially, that is how they're able to keep their power going in a globalized, fully connected, internet-powered world.
And it seems like they're using their market size as a leverage to pretty much practice the same perspective here in the United States. We saw it with NBA, we saw it with Disney. Is there any hope?
Yes, there's hope, and really the hope lies in creating a separation from the Chinese Communist Party,
which
from
is
the free world.
Right?
It has to be a decoupling. The only engagement that really serves the interests of any free country with the Chinese Communist Party is one that seeks to do diplomatic engagement at the highest levels to prevent conflict or confrontation in a military sense. Anything else that seeks to cooperatively bring them into the international order in a way that will see them promoting the norms and principles and values of that system is bound to fail because their Communist Party constitution essentially repudiates that. Also, document number 13, which was an internal Communist Party document leaked after Xi Jinping came to power, essentially outlines why universal human rights are actually tied to destroying the Chinese Communist Party and must be suppressed everywhere. So it is within their ideology to suppress freedoms and democratic principles and human rights all over the world because they're afraid that that might take root in China.
So it's all against all the values and ideals of the Western civilization. Yet a lot of countries in the West are aligned with the Chinese direction and Chinese perspective. I lived in Canada for 11 years. And Canada seemed to have a very big problem with respect to allowing Huawei building their 5G infrastructure. And maybe we talk a little about 5G, what 5G is, because a lot of people think that this is just going to be a faster internet connection. But the reality is that platform and the network are becoming one with 5G. Would you expand on that and explain the dangers of it if the infrastructure of 5G is built by the Chinese?
Yeah, everybody is, I think, quite aware that companies like Google and Amazon and Facebook collect your data and do what they want with it, ostensibly to provide you better goods and services that really match what you're looking for, almost try to predict what you're thinking. Because, when you talk about something, your voice will be picked up and then all of a sudden you're seeing ads for that thing. This is both from a technology platform that the iPhone and Android are the two predominant platforms for that system. And then in a mobile sense, the 4G network is a pipe. Now that's allowed the United States, since it was the first one to come up with a smartphone and really the second country to build a 4G network, to be predominant in the global economy, since really, 2015 or so. And those companies continue to extract data from around the world and create value for those companies. And the Chinese really figured this out and and wanted to do the same thing for 5G. So you alluded to 5G as a platform. I think this is where people are really confused about what 5G is. It's not about providing you a faster cell phone. It's really about allowing you to decouple yourself from the cell phone, to leave the cell phone behind because it's built into the world around you. You walk outside, you say Uber, and an Uber shows up because a camera basically saw you, recognized your face using artificial intelligence, read your lips, or a microphone picked up your voice, realized you wanted an Uber and sent it to you, and then you get in the car and it takes you on your way. And so all of these services are going to be built into the city around you. That's the idea behind smart cities. The challenge for democracy is the challenge that we have with China, because as those networks get built, and as Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent essentially from behind the Great Firewall perfect the apps, services, and business models of the 5G world and begin to deploy them around the world, then they'll have the ability to really challenge Facebook, Amazon, and Netflix and Google in their space and really dominate those. And over time, what you'll see is strategic partnerships or mergers happen with those. And so when that happens, you've got Baidu essentially overtaking Google, essentially Facebook being dominated by Tencent, and then you got Alibaba taking over Amazon. And when you have that, then you have the power to use that data not just to make money for those companies, but also to collect intelligence and surveillance. And so people would listen to this and say, "Oh, this is just me being alarmist." But there's a report out of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute by Samantha Hoffman called "Engineering Global Consent," and that report basically talks about a company called Global Tone Communication Corporation. This is a big data AI company that's in China that collects data to do translation in 65 languages. So they use machine learning to essentially translate languages for you of teleconferences. That technology is built into some Huawei products. In any case, they collect 2 to 3 petabytes of data per year. 1 petabyte is 1,000 terabytes. So the interesting thing about Global Tone Communication Corporation is that they're owned collectively by the Ministry of Finance in the PRC and the propaganda arm or the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. So that 2 to 3 petabytes of data, in addition to being used to translate language, go to the intelligence apparatus of the Chinese regime and in the influence apparatus of the Chinese regime. So this is what's happening with 5G because you're decoupled from your smartphone. You no longer have an ability to opt out because when you could basically say I'm not going to own a smartphone, therefore people aren't going to be able to collect data about me. Now, because it's built into the city around you, there's no opting out. It is essentially, what I would expect to see happening is even if Huawei is not building a network in your town, Baidu is putting up cameras right now so that they can begin to collect information so that they can help, make money selling you services, like Uber, creating these virtual button pushes, but also begin to know more about you so that if you do at any time, decide to have something of relevance to Chinese national interests, then they'll have some kind of hooks into you. So I've been asked, what would be the future of a world like this? And the future is essentially this, that you come home every single day and you teach your child as they grow what things they can say and what things they can't say to prevent from angering the Chinese Communist Party and bringing financial ruin on the family. And people say, okay, well that would never happen. And I have friends that have lived here in the U.S. for a long time, 5 years. Their kids have grown up in the school system, and then around the time that they get ready to move back to China, they're having to begin to re-educate their children about what they can say and what they can't say as they go back into China, to prevent exactly what I'm talking about from happening. So as we're so connected, using globalization and the internet,
I'm
this
sorry,
is the
don't mind the dogs in the
case.
background.
I have two of those too.
One of the things I keep talking about to my audience is that technology is progressing exponentially while our perception is linear. So it's not like we can expect the change. It's like people don't even remember how things were 20 years ago,
Right.
before like mainstream internet and smartphones and all that. And this self-censorship that you're talking about, I imagine it would take only a generation, because it's like the 5 monkey experiment that you start, whatever monkey reaches for that banana on top of the ladder. So
It is literally today with Chinese people that live in China. It is subconsciously done.
right.
It is so automatic to the way that they live because it just becomes built into the system. And there's an element of once you don't have an access to anything like books or any kind of outside information that gives you any idea that the world could be in any way different, then it really constrains how you think about the world.
Yeah, I think North Korea is a very good example how this model, when it goes extreme. I remember watching something. Wolf Blitzer was in Pyongyang, and in each apartment there was a radio that plays propaganda 24/7. You can't turn it down, but you can't turn it off. And I think people here they just don't get the intention of the Chinese that is very hegemonic. They're doing it with One Belt, One Road initiative that I'm showing it to our viewers right now, that they basically want to build a new Silk Road, but this is not on the basis of consent by countries who are involved. They are buying their ports in a way. They're buying their debts, which can be called, I guess, debt colonization, but they're doing the very same thing with data. That is a very alien concept to majority of people in the West. That what do you mean by data colonization? So I just don't know. As I said, even if United States manages to decouple from the Chinese, it seems like we have to rethink our entire alliances, because Canada is going the Chinese way. A lot of European countries are going the Chinese way. So is it going to be that China will be in control of the majority of the world, and United States would be this isolationist, literally building the wall and a firewall? The United States will become a new Chinese model that we just block everything, all access to outside information, just to be safe.
Yeah, unfortunately, the mainstream media doesn't really pick up the fact that there's been a quiet effort at diplomacy throughout the Trump administration. It really started in 2018, where we put a lot of work in 2017 in the strategy in identifying the problem and really refining the message. And then in 2018, the administration began to have bilateral discussions with allies and partners to say, hey, here's the challenge. We've got to change our system to protect ourselves. And so now you're seeing country after country in the EU begin to say, hey, we're not going to build Huawei. Now, we've got a long ways to go, but what I can tell you is I'm fairly confident now that as you look across the European landscape, developed countries, particularly ones that are allies and partners of the United States, are choosing not to align themselves with the Chinese in ways that are counter to what we tell them are that we don't want to see. And so that I think is a good news story. I think the challenge remains for the emerging market world, and certainly those other authoritarian regimes that are going to stay very closely tied to China. You're going to see countries in Africa and Latin America and really some of the poor countries in Asia and Central Asia really continue to be on the side of China because they provide them very cheap things, as you alluded to, and provides for economic development. That being said, over time, the idea is to focus on growing and strengthening democracies, their economies, their science and technology, their STEM education, their infrastructure, their manufacturing base. So all of that is a long-term, effort. We got into this position over 3 decades with this close relationship with China. It's going to take probably at least a decade for us to begin to create a different alternative so that those other nations that have been kind of blinded by China can look up and see, okay, that model's not working so great anymore for me. Maybe I'm going to try this other model. I mean, this is why we were so successful in the Cold War. We focused on strengthening democracies and promoting them and allowing that system to be a beacon to those people that didn't live in that space. At the end of the Cold War, we abandoned that and let totalitarians essentially take innovation, technology, talent, and capital, repackage it in their own ideals, and re-export it to the world. This is something that we just cannot allow to continue.
I think one of the best examples of what you talked about with respect to democracy is what is happening in Hong Kong, that people are waving American flag. I have an American flag in my room. I had an American flag in Tehran. I smuggled it from Cyprus. It's not because we loved a U.S. government, it's that it represents certain kind of values
Right.
and ideals. And you mentioned Trump, and I know that you work with the Trump administration. I'm supporting Trump re-election in 2020, and I know a lot of people who support him, majority of whom care about China and what we are doing with China as the priority of what's happening. Are you confident about Trump to be the best representative for American interests? Because I also see Joe Biden, who sees that, well, China is not going to eat our lunch. It's not that big of a deal. And Michael Bloomberg, it seems like have a lot in common with the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and so I think there's a confusion between personalities and politics and national security policy. I try to stay very focused on national security policy. I try to look at what are the things that the candidates are going to do. So I got to say, I saw what Biden did with the Obama administration. I've heard what Bloomberg did. So if you, in the case of Bloomberg, he had his Bloomberg media did a article on Xi's family and about all the wealth that they had. So the Bloomberg terminals that represents the majority of his wealth. The Chinese Communist Party basically turned them off in China and said, don't do it again. And so now Bloomberg media self-censors when it comes to reporting on corruption and things within China that have to do with the senior leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. So there is an element of establishment throughout our political system, and these establishment politicians have essentially benefited by the system and want to perpetuate the system, and that's why they talk about the negativity of tariffs, and they talk about not wanting to not invest our retirement funds into Chinese companies that aren't subject to our standards for audit and transparency. And yet, so for me, it is really about who's going to have the policies that actually protect the American people in this different way that the 21st century, presents challenges to their continuing freedoms.
That person is Trump, or do you see any better
I,
kind
so
of
I, I
alternative?
think the Trump, so having seen this, I think the Trump administration, at least today, is best positioned to do that. That being said, I don't know. I can't predict where the election outcome is going to be. I know that the Democratic side of the House and a lot of establishment Republicans are leaving politics because I think there's a recognition that there is a change afoot in the United States, and I think it was brought on by the American people. And so both parties, I think, have to address the challenges clearly, see the Chinese Communist Party for what it is, see the world for what it is, and really figure out new ways to protect the American people. And I think whatever candidate does that best will win in 2020.
How do you feel about the current socio-political state in the United States? Because a lot of people believe that the country has never been more divided, and the division is more apparent because of social media. How do you see it?
Well, so there's a social welfare statistic that measured satisfaction, societal satisfaction, and I can't remember the name of it, but in 2007, when the iPhone came out, U.S. was number one on that, and within 10 years of that. And certainly China's entry into the WTO, it was number 17. So I think the loss of 70,000 factories, the loss of over 13 million jobs in the United States when we deindustrialized and really sent all work, manufacturing work to China and all the support jobs, I think that had a deep scarring impact on our society. Not to mention that those pension funds and those retirement funds and health benefits that went away added to the national debt in terms of entitlements. So there was a knock-on effect from what happened when the U.S. corporations essentially offloaded their manufacturing capacity to China. Now they were able to increase their margins. So now, for instance, Apple has cash on hand of about $260 billion, and they've become a $1 trillion company by having these enormous margins. But if you look at what they did, it was on the basis of slave labor and pollution. So they created a country that produces 30% of the carbon in the entire world and really has almost like slave labor conditions in a lot of cases, particularly in the cases of Xinjiang. And so, what needs to happen is for that to be healed is for those communities within the United States to be made whole. Now that requires that we actually invest in industrial base in our manufacturing and infrastructure, in research and development that actually drives economic growth and then reshoring the things that allow you to manufacture.
Something about manufacturing jobs that I wonder about is that beside tax cuts and bringing jobs back to United States, it's also the matter of automation, because unless you're going to nationalize companies or factories, how are you going to force them to hire American workers, for example, rather than just automate? I think Foxconn was a good example in Wisconsin, that first they promised to build a plant, and then we realized that they've already invested $2+ billion on automating their factories, and then Trump called the head of the corporation, and that's how it works. So how do you see this moving forward? Because that's actually one of the aspects of Trump administration, what he's talking about, that long term, I just don't see how it's going to work out when we are entering the age of automation.
Yeah, so there's actually three good labor studies. There's one by the Upjohn Institute. There's one by David Autor and colleagues at MIT, and there's another one by the Economic Policy Institute. All of them take on this question of China entering the WTO. I think they all look at the question of automation. Did all these jobs go away from automation? I think the Upjohn Institute did the best job of actually isolating semiconductor manufacture because of Moore's law that was actually calculated as part of the productivity change. And so when you isolate for that industry alone, and you look at the numbers, it's clear that the factory employment that went away was not because of automation. It was because factories moved to China. Now, I've talked to people that saw factories, dismantled brick by brick, particularly a Corning glass factory that had just had maybe $300 million of investment in it, and it was dismantled brick by brick and shipped to China and reassembled, and was making glass. So this is what happened. The equipment, the tooling, the facilities, they were all moved to China for manufacturing. So some of those had automation, and certainly we're going to have increased automation, but the factories themselves still employed people, and they're still going to employ some amount of people. So it is just it's a convenient trope of theoretical economists to uphold this idea of free market economics. Now, free market economics theoretically work. Unfortunately, in practice, what we find is market failure always occurs because there's some company that seeks to dominate that industry or market, and when they do, they start acting monopolistically. Now, there's a good book by Matt Stoller that talks about the ebb and flow of monopolies versus, and the breakup of monopolies with regard to democracies. And so it's really a challenge for democracies today because we've had such consolidation in large corporations, and the ownership of businesses have really been stripped from a lot of small business owners, particularly because of this, because of what China has done in terms of dominating industries and subsidizing them. Like if you're a factory owner in China, you don't pay for your electrical power. That's given to you by the state. All of these subsidies that come to you that really enable you to make a profit. These are things that the Chinese government do for a specific purpose. That's to create employment so they stay in control. And so for us to get back to where we need to be, the tariffs are so important. Just one part of the mechanism. There's a whole broad array of policy options that need to be brought to bear in order to change and rebalance this economic differential that we've essentially allowed to occur.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Spalding's book is called Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. It came out on October 1st, 2019. What made you write a book at this point, and how the feedback has been so far?
The feedback's been great. It's sold over 10,000 copies now.
Congratulations!
Thank you. In just 2 months. I'm literally getting emails from all over the world. People are reading the book. I just had a Polish language version published. I've had a Chinese language version that's just going to be published and released next month. I think it's really opening people's eyes to what's happened to the world and what we need to do to really put us back on a track to promoting democracy.
I imagine you have to deal with a lot of Chinese Communist Party trolls online as well as a consequence of your stance on with respect to China, right?
Actually, it hasn't been that bad. I think part of the problem is I've been at this for so long that I've seen all the tricks. So it's very hard for them to use the standard arguments. They, once they're through the standard arguments, the Communist Party doesn't equip them with anything more. So it's if you don't know how the system works, it's very easy to pull the wool over people's eyes. They have a harder time with me, and so I think they tend to stay away.
Have you been to China yourself? I'm sure you've been.
Yes, I lived there for 2 years, from 2002 to 2004 in Shanghai. Loved it, loved the people, loved the language. I learned to speak it at a Defense Language Institute. It was a wonderful time, and quite frankly, at that point, I didn't understand the government or the party. It wasn't only till later when I started working on it at the Pentagon. And then in 2016, I went to be the senior defense official in Beijing. So I was essentially our country's military representative to China right before I went into the White House.
Yeah, it seems like everything blew up after Xi Jinping and after Trump. He made it a priority to talk about it. We see more clearly what's happening in Hong Kong and to a lower degree in Taiwan, but we don't really know about the opposition to the government inside the mainland China. Now, Xinjiang is one example. But what is happening with respect to the rest of the country? How you mentioned very correctly that if you don't get the information, if you don't know what is happening, there is no reason, and then it comes with self-censorship and all that. How do you assess the level of opposition and disagreement to the central government in the mainland China?
Well, so I mean, there's tens of thousands of protests every year in China, and it's usually around some corrupt official, local official that's doing something and really upsetting the people. They're putting in a power generation factory that's going to create pollution for the local community, or somebody is essentially seizing land for some real estate deal that they want to make money on. The country is a totalitarian regime. It's not like Xinjiang everywhere, but certainly the arm of the state is there. It's funny because, I remember living in Shanghai. I went to Beijing and I was in this market, and I found this air raid siren, and it looked really old. And so I went and looked at it, and I talked to the owner, and he said he had bought it from a PLA warehouse, a People's Liberation Army warehouse. And he said that they told him that it had been captured from Americans during the Korean War. And then, sure enough, it had U.S. stamped on it. And so I bought this thing, and I was going to take it home, and I had to have it shipped. And so before I gave it to the shipping agent, I just wanted to try it out to see what it sounded like. Now, we were in the middle of a market. There's nobody there. I turned this siren, and it sounds like a loud air raid siren. Within just a matter of a few, like 1 minute, there was literally 50 officers around me. And before that, I hadn't seen any. And so, and they were coming to see what was going on. And then when they saw what I was doing, they started laughing and all went away. But it just gives you an idea of the apparatus that exists in the country that you're not aware of until, something brings it out. And in fact, you see that, these the People's Armed Police and the Ministry of State Security are very large organs within the country and are able to suppress any dissent. And of course, you've got the 50 Cent Army online that does a good job of not preventing dissent. What they prevent is collective dissent. So if you are a blogger or a poster and you put up things, sometimes they'll let you, if you're complaining about a local official, they'll let you do it. But as soon as 2, 3, 10 people start to follow you and it really, become more of a collective protest, then they shut it down and delete everything. So this was actually covered by a Harvard research study that showed that, China had become very sophisticated in suppressing collective dissent. So there's a lot of things that the apparatus does that are really hidden, that you don't see when you live there. And quite frankly, because I was just there not causing any trouble, I never saw it. And so the first time, it wasn't until later that I really started trying to understand China and the Chinese Communist Party that I began to realize how deep the challenge was.
I had to leave Iran as a political dissident, and I was human trafficked through a number of countries, including China. This is in 2006. We flew from Kuala Lumpur to Hong Kong, took a bus to the border, and then took a cab into Guangzhou, and then flew to Shanghai in Canada. And quite honestly, the way that they're dealing with their surveillance system, with social credit system, that all the cameras, facial recognition, all that, I can't even imagine. I had no idea back then about anything that we were talking about with respect to China. But it seems like they have mastered the game of surveillance, and they're using it to the best of their advantage. And the Western countries are taking notice, and they're like, "Oh, this is working really good for the Chinese government." Is there any kind of a threat of the so-called democratic governments in the West modeling for the sake of security and safety after the experiments that are being done by the Chinese government?
I think right now it's mostly limited to those more authoritarian or emerging market economies. But I mean, it is the capability is incredible. In fact, I had somebody working for me at the embassy that got one of those on one of those mobikes, and the mobike is a bike that started showing up in Beijing in late 2016, where you could use your phone and scan a QR code. It would unlock the bike, you ride it somewhere and lock it, and then it would charge you for however much distance you use. This guy left his iPad in the basket of the bike and went back to the embassy. He gets to the embassy, realizes he's forgot his iPad, goes in the regional security office. The regional security office calls the public security bureau, and they immediately call the guy on the phone that's got the iPad. That's how connected the system is in Beijing now, and increasingly throughout all of China. So they just went live on 50 5G networks or 50 cities with 5G networks on 1 November of this year. That penetration of technology and surveillance system, both from because everybody uses a smartphone and are in the apps, and China has access to that data, plus the cameras with facial recognition, you really have this ability to monitor quite closely the population and incentivize them to do things, that the Chinese Communist Party thinks make you a good citizen.
And because of the firewall, the apps are very limited too. I think there are only 2 or 3 of them that people do everything with them, basically, from ordering food to go to chatting. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the WeChat app can almost be considered a platform, much like the iOS is a platform for the iPhone. And so you open the WeChat app, and then once you open the WeChat app, you have all of these other apps that you can use to, order airline tickets or order food or pay for things. And it really is an incredible suite of tools. Of course, all of that data is collected by WeChat, and then the Chinese Communist Party has access to it.
And that's part of the constitution, that if the Chinese Communist Party asks for data, or anything that the company has, or a Western company that works within China, if they ask for information, they have to hand it over.
They have to have it, yes.
Yeah. I don't know what to say. It's it's kind of dystopian, but it is what it is, I guess. What can we learn from the Chinese? Because it's completely unfair to say that they haven't had the success. They had the model, they had the objective that they wanted to reach, and they seem to be very successful at it.
No, I think, during the Cold War, particularly in the Eisenhower administration, the United States invested in infrastructure. So we built things like the Eisenhower National Highway System. We invested in technology, R&D, research and development, basic science research. We invested in science, technology, engineering, and math education. We created a lot of scientists, particularly during the space race. And then we invested in our manufacturing base. We had, huge manufacturing, areas like in Detroit. China for the last 30 years has been investing in their economy and in their people. So that's one thing that I would say is quite laudable. We are today $5 trillion in arrears in infrastructure investment in the United States. We haven't been spending we were spending 2% of gross domestic product in the 60s in basic science research. Today it's less than 0.7%, and most of that's going to the National Institute of Health, and most of that, if not all of it, is also going to China. On STEM education, we don't fund STEM education anymore. Most of the students now in STEM educational billets within the U.S. universities are from China. And then finally, on manufacturing, we've lost so many factories, we can't manufacture things anymore. And so we can begin to invest in our country and in our people. I think that's one. In terms of development of emerging market economies in ways that both connect them to the global economy, but also provide for their population. If you look at our organizations like USAID, they'll get money that the Congress gives them to, say, do a water project in Ethiopia. It's not tied to any other thing. And so these developmental projects from Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the TDA, Exim Bank, USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. None of these are focused on kind of what I would call strategic investment for geopolitical reasons. So you're not just promoting the economies and the societies, you're also promoting the principles and the institutions of those same countries in ways that allow them to grow strong economically and prosperous, but also begin to have the kind of rule of law and civil liberties that we want to promote. We could do a much better job of coordinating that activity. But these are the things that we're going to have to learn from the Chinese in terms of development. They'll look at a country and they'll say, hey, I need a raw material out of this country. I want to connect it to China so they can use it to manufacture. At the same time, I want to be able to sell to these people. So let's create the mine, the port, the rail, the roads, the telecommunications links, the water, the power. Once we have that, let's bring in low value added manufacturing, shoes, textiles. Let's put them to work. Okay, now we have that. Let's give them housing. Okay, now we have that. Let's start to sell them $50 smartphones. Let's get them WeChat. Let's get them some electronic payments. Let's get the government some cameras so they can start watching the population. Make sure that they can round up their troublemakers. We'll show them how to do all that. And now you've got a built-in kind of IT-based authoritarian society that's fully plugged into China and can be part of its ecosystem. Oh, by the way, in doing all that, they've moved a lot of their population of excess males in China into that country. They did the original construction. They do manufacturing. They start businesses to the tunes of tens of thousands of people that come from China into these countries. And then you create this outside force that actually is very supportive of the regime because they're economically and financially tied into it. So, I mean, it's a really good, smart model in the terms of what they've done. I call it building, not breaking. The chief export of the United States has been breaking things using war in the last 2 decades. I think in the next 2 decades, we can say we've been builders and not breakers. I think we're going to be successful in kind of countering the rise of totalitarianism in our world.
That's an excellent message. A lot of our audience are from Canada. Do you have any thoughts with respect to the relationship between Canada and China, especially how Canada has detained the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, and 2 Canadians are still taken basically hostages, political hostages in China? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's about rule of law versus rule by law. I think Meng Wanzhou clearly has been indicted for bank fraud. There's a lot of, I mean, ZTE, for instance, does it directly. I mean, they were sending fraud payments directly from the headquarters. I think they were doing this in order to support the Iranian regime, by selling them goods. This is indisputable. The evidence is clear. It wasn't done to have trade leverage. It was done because she broke the law. And quite frankly, Huawei and many other companies continue to do things that violate rules and norms. In terms of the Canadian individuals that are detained, it's not clear that they did anything. And in fact, we know that China does extrajudicial detainment all the time for the purposes of whatever they want to do. You say you're the billion-dollar head of a company. You angered the Communist Party. Guess what? You're going to go away for a while. Maybe even permanently. This is the way China works. There is no due process. There is no right to see an attorney or have any kind of justice is blind scenario. It is the Communist Party is the law. And they make the decision what's going to happen to you. And so, I think, from Canada's standpoint, I mean, there's only one choice. It's really, promoting and supporting the rule of law, civil liberties, human rights, democratic principles, free trade, the things that we tried to instantiate in the international order after World War II. And that's what the United States is trying to do. Despite all of this noise that says we're trying to be isolationist. No, we're trying to not destroy the international system. We're trying to, in some ways, rebuild it so it begins to be, the Human Rights Council can be the Human Rights Council and not the Human Wrongs Council. That's going to take a lot of work, and we're going to have to work with allies and partners. Like I said, our diplomats have been talking to them. And I think if you look at the bureaucratic level of a lot of these countries, governments, that are especially democracies, they've heard this message from the United States quite clearly, and they're trying to figure out how they implement, the same kind of protections in their own societies.
Yeah, the Human Rights Council that is led by Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, is a bit of a head scratcher.
It is very much so.
Dr. Spalding's book is called Self-War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. What is next for you, and where can our audience follow your future works?
So I'm 2020. I'm just going to be talking about the challenge of the rise of totalitarianism in the world. I just got back from Poland and Lithuania and the UK. I'm going to different countries and throughout the United States to talk about this, using the book as a platform to start a dialogue. Let's have a conversation. You may not agree with everything that the United States stands for, and you may have some grievances because of some of the things that we've done in foreign policy. You may continue to have those grievances, but that doesn't preclude us from having a logical, fact-based conversation about how we protect democracy in a globalized, internet-powered world where our data is easily taken and used for things that we don't want it to be.
I imagine that your book has created a lot of attention and traction in Japan as well. Is that right? Because Japanese seem to be on the forefront of the Chinese conflict.
Yes, Japan, Australia, countries like this, in Europe, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, most of those countries that were under the boot of the Soviet Union really are responding to the message. So I think it's, my belief is we're on a good trajectory. We have to just keep working. We have to keep focusing on the challenges we face and work on them together.
Excellent. Let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is our greatest achievement?
The worst thing that we've done is probably what's going on. Some of the stuff that's going on in China right now, putting people in concentration camps and organ harvesting, I think is absolutely horrendous. That being said, I think there are acts of kindness in our world every single day, and if we choose to see the good in people, then that is where true humanity, the benefit of humanity lies.